I am honored to be speaking with the author of the recent study, Rhetoric and Frame Analysis of ExxonMobil's Climate Change Communications, as well as the seminal book, Merchants of Doubt. Dr. Naomi Oreskes, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Nice to be here with you.
Well, you start this study's brief by noting this is the first computational assessment of how ExxonMobil has used language to subtly yet systematically frame public discourse about climate change. What were you hoping to accomplish with this study?
Yeah, that's a good question. What were we hoping to accomplish? Well, this study is part of a larger project that I have with my research associate, Geoffrey Supran, to understand the ways in which the fossil fuel industry, not just ExxonMobil, but the fossil fuel industry in general, has tried to undermine action on climate change. And we know from work that I've been involved with, going back to writing Merchants of Doubt, that part of that strategy has been to make people unsure about the problem, unsure what it even is, unsure how serious it is, unsure if there's a scientific consensus, et cetera, et cetera. And so a few years ago, when Inside Climate News in the Los Angeles Times first started reporting on the disparities between ExxonMobil's history versus what they had been saying in public, we took up the challenge of trying to better understand that discrepancy. And so we published a paper in which we analyzed the difference between what ExxonMobil scientists were writing in reports that they wrote for the company versus what the company was saying in public. And we showed in that paper that there was a huge disparity between what was going on in private, which was pretty much consistent with what scientists were saying at the time. We found almost nothing to object to about what was being said in private, but what was being said in public was very different, much more promoting this notion that we didn't really know, it would be too hard to fix, it would be too expensive, and don't worry, it's all going to be okay anyway. After we finished that study, Geoffrey wanted to dig a little deeper. And there were two things he wanted to try to do. One was to try to understand not just the overt disparities between public and private, but some of the more subtle ways in which language was used to create the impression of uncertainty without necessarily lying. And this has been a big issue for me in all of my work because, sometimes people will say, oh, I'm accusing people of lying. Well, not usually. I mean, sometimes people really do lie, but so much of this disinformation is much more subtle than that. It's much more clever because if you catch someone in an outright lie, that's really bad for them and they know that. So they will do their best to try not to lie outright, but to shade the truth, to tell half-truths, misrepresentations. And so we were trying to come up with a way to get at some of those more nuanced strategies. And in addition, of course, ExxonMobil accuses us of being subjective and biased. So we were thinking, well, what kinds of techniques, what kind of methods do we have that are not subjective? And so Geoffrey came up with the idea of doing this comparison, this quantitative analysis of both the words used and the associations between words that would both get at this question of the more nuanced use of language and also quantify it in a way that we hoped would be persuasive.
Well, what were the climate change communications that you were studying when you were looking at just how Exxon talked about climate change and global warming?
Well, we looked at all the same documents we had used that in our previous report. So that includes all of the publicly available private documents. So reports that ExxonMobil wrote, scientific papers that were co-authored by ExxonMobil scientists, but also papers that were presented at trade associations and things that were said in public. For example, in the advertisements that were formatted to make them look like editorials. But in addition, we were also able to identify additional reports that ExxonMobil had issued that became part of this corpus. So over 200 documents in total.
So just help me understand a little bit, what would the purpose be of these peer-reviewed research papers for a company like ExxonMobil?
Well, the purpose for ExxonMobil, particularly if we go back to the 1970s and 80s, was for them to understand what this problem was, because the corporate executives clearly understood that climate change was potentially a very significant issue for their business model. And we know this in part because they themselves discuss things like the carbon budget and the carbon budget, the whole notion of a carbon budget is saying, well, there's only so much oil, gas, and coal that we can afford to burn. And therefore, once we get past that, companies like ExxonMobil may have to do something else. So this shows that they are very, very well aware of this problem, going back to the late 1970s. And they are aware of what this might mean for their business model. And so the question then becomes, what do they do about it? And the way I view it was that they had a kind of fork in the road in the 1980s, particularly around 1988, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is first formulated, when Jim Hansen testifies in Congress that climate change is underway, and then in 1992, when the US signs the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is a kind of crucial scientific and political moment where scientists are saying this is real, it's starting to happen, and we need to do something about it. And political leaders are listening. And so ExxonMobil faces a fork in the road. They can either listen to their own scientists, listen to global scientists, and say, okay, well, we have to figure out a different business model, or they can deny the science. And sadly, they took the second route.
And your paper is kind of talks about or describes the evolution, of how they've changed the way they have talked about that from outright denial to shifting responsibility and things like that. So, your paper talks about framing. So why is framing such an essential rhetorical tool here to examine?
Framing is a concept that comes out of communication theory. And what it says is that what matters to people when we communicate, it's not just the words that we use, but it's also the context in which those words are used, the frame that we put around it. So if I say, to a friend, I really like Joe, I might be just saying, I like Joe, he's a good guy. But if we've been talking about boyfriends and girlfriends and I say, I really like Joe, that might have a different, it's the same word like, but we know that the word like can have, a romantic connotation or just a platonic connotation, depending upon the framing. And so framing is very important for understanding the meaning of words in context. And so part of what we try to do in this new paper is to better understand what are the frames that ExxonMobil is using. And we can do that then by looking not just at the specific choice of words, but the frequency of words and the associations of words. And so one of the key things we find in this new paper is that we see ExxonMobil, particularly in the later years, increasingly framing the notion of climate change in terms of risk. Now, this is a very clever strategy. I always said they're highly intelligent people. They can't use ignorance or stupidity as an excuse for what they've done. ExxonMobil uses the word risk. And of course, in some sense, climate change is a risk. It's not a lie, because it's certainly a financial risk for the company. But the crucial thing about that word is that most of us, when we hear the word risk, we can contrast that with reality. That is to say, a risk is something that might happen, it might not. If I ride a motorcycle without a helmet, I'm taking a risk, but I might be fine. If I go rock climbing, I'm taking a risk and I might be fine. But by the 1990s and 2000s, climate change wasn't just a risk. It was a reality. It was something that was happening. And certainly by the 2000s, something that scientists could document was doing damage in the world.
And this really builds off of your work in Merchants of Doubt, right? Like, we can't talk about scientific uncertainty without talking around climate change, or really, a host of other industries or threats to humanity, without talking about Merchants of Doubt. Why do you think this strategy of trying to make the public believe the science isn't clear has worked for so long across so many of these hazardous industries?
Well, I'd say it works for two reasons. One is that it's very, very clever. And it's based in part on work that the Merchants of Doubt themselves did. So we know that the tobacco industry, going back to the 1960s and 70s, was doing research, market research, on what messages would be effective. And one of the things they found, and we know that the fossil fuel industry recapitulated the same sort of research in the 1990s, using focus group studies, was that if people believe that the science is uncertain, then they will be less likely to act, and they will be less likely to support other people's actions. So less likely to vote for a candidate who wants to make climate change a high priority, less likely to support putting a price on carbon, less likely to support regulations to improve gas fuel efficiency. So if you can persuade people that the science is uncertain, then you can do a lot to slow or stop action. And that, of course, is exactly what the tobacco industry wanted to do with respect to tobacco control. And it's what the fossil fuel industry has wanted to do with respect to action to prevent climate change.
So in your paper, what are the other differences that you found between the public comments that Exxon was making through their advertorials and what they were saying within the company?
Hold on, I just realized there was a second thing I wanted to say about the other question. I'm pretty sure, didn't I say two things and I forgot what the second was? So if we could just go back to the uncertainty framework. The other reason why the uncertainty framework works is because it's a kind of jujitsu move. It's taking the strength of science and using it against it. And this is something that we explained in Merchants of Doubt. So science is uncertain. All science is uncertain. Science is a learning process. You know, we use the word science to refer to two very different things. We use the word science to refer to knowledge, facts, things that we believe we know about the world. And when you take a science course, you get taught a lot of facts. But we also use science to talk about the process, the enterprise of scientists doing research. And that's a learning process. And because science is a learning process, there are always uncertainties. There are always things we don't know. There are always more details that can be worked out. And so what the Merchants of Doubt do is to take the genuine uncertainties in science and exaggerate them, hype them, make it seem as if the uncertainties are so great that they overshadow the knowledge. And again, if you can persuade people that the uncertainties are very great, then you can distract their attention from what we really know. And this is what we've seen very, very consistently in the climate change era. We know an awful lot about the climate system. We know the temperatures of the earth have heated up. We know that the cause is more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that come from burning fossil fuels and deforestation and some forms of agriculture. And we know that the overall heating of the globe is impacting people in damaging ways. It's killing coral reefs, it's affecting agriculture, it's making floods worse, it's making hurricanes worse, it's making heat waves worse. People die from heat waves. All of this is known, but by focusing on the uncertainties, they can distract attention from what's known and shift attention to what is still not certain. And so again, that feeds into the strategy of, well, if people think it's uncertain, then they don't support action.
Well, and
yeah,
we know this, and we know the solutions too. And not only did ExxonMobil try to inject uncertainty about global warming and its causes, but it is also, your paper has found that it tried to convince the public that solutions like renewable energy resources and electric vehicles are not viable solutions. So how did they do that?
Well, a variety of techniques, but again, focusing on repeating certain claims about renewable energies, that renewable energy is too expensive, that it's too inefficient, that it's too unreliable. I like to say the message is kind of renewable energy is for sissies. It's too intermittent. Like you hear this all the time about the intermittency problem, but the reality is that we can manage that. Yes, it's true the wind doesn't always blow, but there was a great study that was done a few years ago. It was a collaborative study by some scientists at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And what they did a modeling project to look at the question of whether we could supply the electricity needs of the United States through renewable energy only with existing nuclear power, but no new nuclear power. And what they found was the answer was yes. And it was rather simple because what they showed looking at weather data is it's true in any given place in the United States, the sun is not always shining. The sun doesn't shine at night. And at any given moment, the wind is not always blowing. But somewhere in the United States, the wind is blowing. And somewhere in the United States, the sun is shining. So if you could integrate the grid, the electricity grid, so that you could more efficiently move energy from Nebraska to Los Angeles, let's say Omaha to Los Angeles, not to confuse cities with states, from Omaha to Los Angeles, Nebraska to California, Arizona to Oregon, that actually you could fulfill the energy needs of the country. But that's not the message that ExxonMobil and the fossil fuel industry has been promoting. They've been promoting, oh, it's too unreliable, it's too inefficient, it's too intermittent. And this is part of, as you said, creating uncertainty about the solution space. So rather than acknowledging that actually the technologies we need exist, we need to make improvements in the electricity grid infrastructure, and we need to fix our regulatory structures so that they're more supportive of renewable energy. But we could do this. But that's not the message. You'll never hear that message from ExxonMobil.
Right. Instead, they've tied American prosperity to the continued burning of fossil fuels. So from your analysis, how did ExxonMobil connect the proliferation of fossil fuel use to to protecting Americans' socioeconomic status?
Well, I think that involves a conflation of the past with the present and the future. So it is certainly the case that in the past, fossil fuels have been extremely important. And there's no question that fossil fuels, first coal, then oil and gas, fueled the Industrial Revolution. They fueled the electricity revolution. They have been the driver of economic activity in the industrialized world for a long time now. And there's no question that fossil fuels are very efficient, right? Oil has, it's really concentrated energy. You can do a lot with oil and gas. And so we had good reasons for adopting oil and gas when we did initially, but things change and we learn. And one of the things we've learned in the 20th century is that the greenhouse gases that are byproducts of burning fossil fuels heat the planet. And that heat is damaging. And that damage is what ExxonMobil refuses to acknowledge.
And it doesn't have to be tied to prosperity, to American prosperity. These false dichotomies have been presented by the fossil fuel industry, but other merchants of doubt, as well as tying either American prosperity or reducing fossil fuels, or either American freedom or regulations to reduce fossil fuels or other harmful pollutants. So why do you think these types of false dichotomies are used to sway public opinion?
This space is filled with false dichotomies. I'm glad you raised this because it's one of the most infuriating things about the disinformation that's promoted by these people. And as you just said, one of the classic false dichotomies is the jobs versus the environment. And I do have to say, I do think that progressives and environmentalists have not done nearly enough work to prove that that is a false dichotomy, because we know that it is. Because in every case where we look closely, we see that actually environmental protection is good for the economy, it's good for people's health, it generates jobs. Right now in the United States, well, things are a bit uncertain because of the COVID-19, but before COVID-19 hit, renewable energy was one of the fastest growing sectors in the US economy. There are far more jobs in renewable energy and energy efficiency than there are in fossil fuels. But you would never know that listening to fossil fuel industry propaganda. They want you to think that if we address this problem, we will lose jobs, it will cost jobs, and nobody wants that, right? And nobody wants to be responsible, for the loss of jobs of our fellow Americans. But it's a big lie. It's not true. The possibilities for generating jobs, good jobs here in the United States that can't be outsourced, is enormous. And, I had a great experience once a few years ago. I sat next to a man who was involved in converting a factory. I think it was in Ohio. It had been a Maytag washing machine factory that had closed, but they were going to reopen it as a wind turbine blade factory. And this was great. I mean, this is what you want. Manufacturing remains very important for the American economy. And what he said to me, he said, yeah, it is true that the cost of labor is higher in Ohio than it is in Vietnam, but the cost of transporting wind turbine blades is very, very high. These blades are giant and they're delicate, and you can't have them be smashed up in transit. So he said it was worth it to them to manufacture them here in the United States. And that's just one example. I mean, obviously solar panel installation, wind power maintenance, so many good jobs in renewable energy and energy efficiency that cannot be outsourced. But again, that's not a message you'll hear from the fossil fuel industry. And unfortunately, it's not a message we've heard enough from environmentalists either. I think environmentalists have begun to realize they need to talk more about jobs. Certainly President Biden understands that. I think he's done an excellent job of linking the green energy economy to job creation. But it's a giant false dichotomy, and it really is time that we laid that false dichotomy to rest.
Another falsehood that the fossil fuel industry and ExxonMobil is perpetuating is this idea of individual responsibility. Like it's our fault that you've been extracting and burning fossil fuels for the last more than a century. How did Exxon use individual responsibility to shift focus away from their contributions to the climate crisis?
So this was one of the other big findings of our latest work, that this notion of individual responsibility was greatly promoted by ExxonMobil. And they did this to a very great extent by talking about demand. They repeatedly used the word demand or the phrase consumer demand. So to create a kind of impression, well, what is driving this? It's consumer demand. This is what people want. And of course, as someone who studied the history of the tobacco industry, that's exactly what the tobacco industry did. Oh, well, smokers want to smoke. Smokers love smoking. This is all driven by consumer demand. Well, of course, consumer demand is part of the story, but it's only one part, and arguably, in my opinion, not the greatest part. Because here's the thing. Yes, it's true. All of us use fossil fuels. We drive cars. We have electricity, although I'm happy to say my lights are all now powered by the PV on my roof, but I still have a gas burning car, which I hope to replace soon now that there are all kinds of great electric cars coming on the market. But of course, demand is part of the story. But the question becomes, but what about the supply piece, right? I mean, supply and demand is the classic framework of economics, but you hardly ever hear ExxonMobil talking about the supply part because that's their responsibility. Instead, they focus on the demand part as a way of focusing on what they want to say is my responsibility. And what I would say about that is, okay, up to a point, yes, we do all have, there is shared responsibility here, but here's the thing. This is a company that has done everything in their power to block action and to make it impossible for me to even have other choices. They have done everything to sustain the fossil fuel economy so that we don't really have, many of us have very few choices. And it's only very recently that electric cars, for example, have become an alternative. And even now they remain rather expensive. And there's massive subsidies to oil and gas production in this country. This is another big lie that we hear a lot. Most Americans think that the renewable energy industry is heavily subsidized. Actually, for every dollar that subsidizes renewable energy, about $10 subsidize oil and gas and coal. So this isn't a free market. This is a heavily regulated, heavily controlled, and heavily subsidized market. And it's a market that has been structured by 100 years of history to encourage consumer demand of oil, gas, and coal and discourage alternatives. So yes, we do make choices, but we make choices in a world that is structured. And a big part of that structure has been created by the fossil fuel industry.
Well, how was Exxon using this fossil fuel savior framing to argue that the public actually, needed to feel like these products were necessary?
Well, this gets back to the issue of the past versus the future. So one of the things that ExxonMobil continues to do is to talk about how we will continue to need fossil fuels. So again, the word need, we need fossil fuels. And as you said, tying it to the notion of prosperity, that the economy needs fossil fuels, that we need fossil fuels. Well, of course, the reality is we do need energy, but energy is not the same as fossil fuels. But what they do with their language is to conflate the two and to use fossil fuels as a stand-in for energy and to say, well, we need fossil fuels because we need to run the economy. And so what Geoffrey and I would say is, well, wait, slow down, stop. We need energy, but that energy could come in the future, could come from different sources.
And it looks like, I think the winds are changing here as far as, our use of fossil fuels and the alternatives. Last week, there's quite a bit of news around oil and gas companies. A majority of Exxon shareholders supported proposals that makes Exxon report on its lobbying activities. So what did you make of that news?
Well, the reporting on lobbying activities is hugely important because ExxonMobil wants to say, as we've just been discussing, we're just an honest company giving the consumer what they want. That's just not true because they spend huge amounts of money and they've been very non-transparent about how much. But other people, for example, Bob Brule at Drexel University have done analyses to suggest at least $500 million, if not much more, has been spent in fossil fuel industry lobbying to prevent action on climate change, to prevent regulatory support for renewable energy, to prevent the sort of thing like the grid integration that I was talking about a moment ago. Massive amounts of lobbying to sustain the fossil fuel industry now and into the future. Massive amounts of lobbying to sustain the fossil fuel infrastructure, and massive amounts of lobbying to prevent change, to prevent us moving into a new form, a new kind of energy system. So that non-transparency really hides what I consider to be a multitude of sins. And so for shareholders to say, wait, we want to know how our money is being spent. I mean, this is money that could have been returned to shareholders. And of course, this is another one of the big lies of, and this isn't just ExxonMobil, this is corporate America in general. I mean, we've been told since the days of Jack Welch at GE that the only responsibility of corporations is to return value to shareholders. Well, first of all, I think we all know that that's nonsense. I mean, if you could return value to shareholders by destroying the world, I don't think most people would think that was a good value proposition. So increasingly, shareholders are saying, wait, hold on. That doesn't really add up. But also, this value is not being returned to shareholders. They're spending hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe more, on lobbying activities to sustain a business model that, in the end of the day, will not be sustainable. And so why should shareholders be paying for that? I mean, shouldn't shareholder value being used to sustain the future of the company in a business model that can, in fact, be carried forward into the future and can continue to return value to shareholders going forward? So I think it's huge that this is happening. I think the fact that we're seeing big investment funds like Vanguard get on board with this is extremely important. And because, of course, if you think about a company like Vanguard, like I have money in Vanguard funds. I mean, many of us do. You don't have to be a billionaire to have money in pension funds or other, index funds that are invested in companies that are doing damage, that are costing us money in other ways. And so I think the fact that the investor community is really no longer sitting on the sidelines, but becoming involved is really a giant step forward. And the other really big news of recent weeks was the IEA report, the International Energy Association. This is an organization that is quite conservative, that in general has been very bearish on renewable energy, has not been at the forefront of thinking through what an energy transition to a sustainable energy future would look like. But they have now come out and said, there's really no place for fossil fuels in the future. This is a giant, giant step forward. And so, and I can imagine there were some pretty intense conversations behind the scenes at IEA. So I think they're really to be applauded for taking this big step. And I think that that's the kind of statement that political leaders and business leaders will take very, very seriously.
And last week, there was a court ruling in the Netherlands that made Shell responsible for its carbon dioxide emissions and the emissions of their suppliers as well. Shell has been ordered to cut its carbon emissions by 45% by 2030. So what was your reaction when you heard that Shell news?
Yeah, well, that was also great news. I mean, that's an incredibly important piece of news as well, because if you think about it, there's something that's actually astonishing about the notion of carbon dioxide emissions, which is that companies dump this pollution into the atmosphere with absolute impunity. We do not allow that in any other area of life anymore. It used to be that companies dumped toxic waste into rivers and streams. It used to be that they spewed mercury and soot and particulates into the atmosphere. We don't allow that anymore. Back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, we passed a whole set of laws, also in the 90s, the Clean Air Act amendments, the Clean Water Act, and other countries have done similar things. We recognize that yes, we want to have economic activity, and yes, we want to have manufacturing, but no, not at the expense of human health and safety. And you don't have the right to make someone else suffer while you manufacture a product. You just don't have the right to do that any more than you would have the right to come and burn down my house. And yet, it's like we've carved out this weird exception for carbon dioxide. And of course, this is why there have been so many fights about, is carbon dioxide a pollutant? And why, again, the fossil fuel industry back in the 90s had this giant campaign to try to persuade us that CO2 wasn't a pollutant, that it was, quote, the stuff of life, that CO2 was good for us. Well, CO2, it's like selenium. I mean, there are a lot of things that are good in small amounts and kill you in large amounts, right? So, the dose makes the poison. Yeah, a certain amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is good. Plants use it. Too much heats the planet and does damage. So this is really a landmark law case because it's saying, no, you cannot do that. This is a pollutant, and you can't just dump CO2 in the atmosphere the way you would, the same way we can't just dump, mercury into the atmosphere. So I think it's a hugely important decision. And of course, it's very appropriate that it took place in the Netherlands for two reasons. Royal Dutch Shell, of course, is incorporated in the Netherlands. They're the world's largest trader of oil and gas. So what they do really matters, sets a standard for the whole industry. And then also, of course, the Netherlands is a distinctly vulnerable country because it sits right at sea level.
Right. Right. I mean, it's such a huge win for climate accountability lawsuits. And there are now a ton of climate accountability lawsuits making their way through the United States legal system. But separate from this case, one thing that we have talked about several times on this show with some legal experts in climate litigation have mentioned what fossil fuel companies were doing, which was much like tobacco companies, was mostly legal. I mean, it's the fact that they've misled on the facts and withheld information from their own studies that they clearly knew about on the harms of their product that introduces the potential legal consequences. So how do you think your work can help better understand what fossil fuel companies were doing?
Well, ExxonMobil, of course, loves to try to use this against me and to claim that I'm biased because my work is used by lawyers. I mean, I am proud of the fact that my work is used by lawyers. Geoffrey and I, and also Eric Conway, I mean, we have done the factual, empirical, historical work to document what these companies have done. And if that work is of use to lawyers and attorney generals and other organizations, we feel proud of that. We feel like this is what academic life should be, that it's interesting and it's theoretical. And, I also write books on theoretical topics. But if my expertise can help make the world a better place, of course I want to do that. So, I think there's two really important things that we understand. Again, the tobacco history is really helpful here. One of the things that Judge Kessler said very clearly in her decision on the big tobacco lawsuit was, the law does not protect fraud. So even if the product itself, like a cigarette, was not itself illegal, fraud is illegal. And so if you commit fraud while trying to sell a legal product, that is still an illegal activity. And I think that template may, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm always careful to say, and I'm not a judge and I'm not the jury, but I think we have good reason to say that there's an analogy there. And the other thing we also know is that it's illegal to mislead your shareholders. And this is why I think we've seen the pension funds, the attorneys general, other organizations, the hedge funds become so involved in this, because I think that there does appear to be evidence that these companies have misled their shareholders by denying in public what they knew in private about the risks they were facing, the fact that we know that they knew about carbon budgets and therefore knew that there was a risk of stranded assets. But again, these risks were not openly and objectively discussed with their investors, with their shareholders, with pension funds. This is a very, very serious matter. And so, it's in the hands of people who know a lot more about securities fraud than I do. But I think, as I said, what Geoffrey and Eric Conway and I have done is as much as we can, as best as we can, to document the historical record, what we know about what these companies knew and what they said about it in public and to their shareholders and to their consumers also, because consumer fraud is also illegal, at least in some states, right?
Yeah. Do you think the American public fully understands the liability of these fossil fuel companies?
I don't think the American people understand it yet, but I think they're about to, because I think that, one of the things I've learned in my own work, the question always comes up, well, how do you talk to climate change deniers, or how do you communicate with people who, aren't on board in this issue? And one of the things that I've really found in my work is that when I talk about the misrepresentations, the misleading claims, the disparities and discrepancies between what these companies said in public versus what they knew or probably knew in private, and it's not just ExxonMobil. I think it's really important to be clear about that. I think there's evidence that a lot of fossil fuel companies have said misleading things or ran misleading advertisements. When people begin to understand that, it's kind of a wake-up call, because what it's really saying is that this has been a big con game. The fossil fuel industry has tried to present themselves, we use this phrase, the fossil fuel savior. They've tried to present themselves as the good guys, that they are responsible for all this prosperity, all these jobs. They've just given us something we wanted. But, at best, that's half the story, and maybe not even half of it. They've also, I think, misrepresented the science, misrepresented their own activities, led us to believe that everything was okay when it really wasn't. And now they've made this problem way worse. And we, the taxpayers, are going to be stuck paying the bill. Because just look at the bill that NOAA has documented for the extreme weather events of recent years, things like Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Maria. Who's paying for that? It's not ExxonMobil, it's the American people, it's taxpayers. So this is like a giant con game where these guys have made billions of dollars in profits, and they've stuck us with the bill. Merchants of Doubt, we had an analogy at the end of the book where we said, imagine this giant banquet where we all feasted to our heart's desire, and then the waiter comes with the bill. And we're shocked. And, some of us deny that we even ate, right? So I think when people begin to realize that we've been conned, nobody wants to be at the losing end of a con. And I think the more people begin to understand that, the more many of them will be angry. And especially as they learn that there are alternatives, that we don't have to depend on fossil fuels forever. It was good while it lasted. I like to say that coal is so 19th century, oil and gas are so 20th century, and now we're in the 21st century. So let's live and act as if we are.
Well, having studied Exxon's communications for so long in the past, how do you think that they may change their messaging to fight further climate liability in the courts, as well as in public opinion?
Well, I think we've already seen some signs of this. I mean, they're going to continue to push the consumer demand idea. They're going to say that it was a choice, that we wanted these things and they were just giving the public what they wanted. And I think that they may also try, another tobacco strategy. I mean, one of the clever things the tobacco industry did was first to deny it and then to say that everybody knew it all along, right? So if we knew it all along, then it was our responsibility because we did these things knowingly. I think there's a good chance ExxonMobil will try that. But again, this is where the discrepancy between what they said in private, what they knew in private and what they said in public is so important. Because if they try to claim, well, everyone understood this was a problem, we can say, well, wait a second, you ran this ad in the New York Times where you said it wasn't. So I think that they're going to be on pretty thin ice, but it doesn't mean they won't try to make the claim. But, I'm not going to give them any other ideas because that's their lawyer's job, and their lawyers get paid a lot more money than I do.
Well, another major point in Merchants of Doubt was the responsibility of the media. So how did you feel about the way major news outlets covered the Shell and Exxon and the Chevron developments last week?
Well, again, I think that was a sea change. I think the news coverage was radically different from what we would have seen even 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, we would have for sure seen many of the major outlets traipsing out some climate change denier to say, well, this is ridiculous. We don't even know if climate change is real. And as far as I know, none of the major media did that this time. And I was just reading a very nice piece by Gillian Tett in the Financial Times. I mean, the sea change, particularly in the financial reporting, is, it's astonishing and it's good. I mean, it's great. And it's really a relief to see the media beginning to cover this without feeling that they have to give credence to disinformation.
Are there other signs that you're seeing of public sentiment changing around fossil fuel companies?
Well, it's hard to know. Public sentiment is a notoriously fickle thing. And, and it's hard to get good survey data. It takes time. I mean, I've been asked a lot this year about COVID-19 and, how COVID-19 has affected public trust in science. A lot of people ask me about the pause in the J&J vaccine. I think it's too soon to tell. We don't have good data yet on many of these things. I think, I try to be careful about let me back up. Sometimes I see people making very bold claims about things for which we do not yet have evidence. I think that's a bad look. So if you think about the J&J pause, I actually wrote a little thing on this recently. There were pundits saying, this is a disaster. This is going to totally undermine trust in science. And the same day, there were people saying, no, this is great. This is science working as it is. This will increase faith in science because scientists are taking their time to do it right. So two diametrically opposed things, both being put forward with great assurance. And I'm sitting there saying, well, we really don't know. And not only do we not know, but actually we ought to be doing work to try to find out, because this is actually a very nice opportunity for us to see how did the public's view of science change as a result of that pause in the J&J vaccine. So I hope someone is out there collecting data, because it's not the kind of work that I generally do. But if I don't see some data coming out soon, I'm going to have to write a grant proposal to figure out how to do some work. It's kind of so important. There's such a great opportunity here to collect data and to actually learn more about how people process information about science and the environment. And I hope that will happen in the coming year.
We've done such incredible work and contributed so much to our understanding of, these attacks against science, what these industries have done to really not only harm Americans and people across the world, but, lie to them, mislead them along the way. So, what is it for you that drives you to do the work that you do?
Yeah, that's a good question. Unremittent idealism. I don't know. I think, yeah, what is it that drives me? That's a good question. I think that, I'm trained as a scientist originally. And like most people who went into science, I think I had a natural curiosity about how the world works. I as a child, I collected rocks and bugs, and I wanted to understand the world around me. And as I got older, I began to realize, well, rocks and bugs are really interesting, but actually people are even more interesting, right? People are more complicated, harder to understand, and that makes them in some ways more interesting. It's a greater challenge to try to understand human dynamics than it is to try to understand geodynamics, let's say. And so that's part of what led me into history of science. I was interested in, well, how do we even know these things? If we say we know that, DNA carries hereditary information, how do we know that? And how do we persuade people that we know that? And it was that work that really led me into climate change denial. When I started to see the clear discrepancy between what scientists were saying about the natural world and what we know about the climate system and how it was changing versus what was being said about it. And in the beginning, like a lot of scientists, I thought it was mostly a matter of ignorance, that people didn't understand. But then when I started looking into it, I realized, no, this is not about ignorance. This is about something much, much worse. And so then at that point, it just became like I couldn't not study it. Once I began to realize that this was not a matter of public education, it wasn't a matter of public understanding of science, it wasn't going to be solved with just better science education in high school, that's when I began to feel that this was a really important area, and that I had a toolkit that enabled me to study it, in part by virtue of my background as an earth scientist, that I could read the climate science and understand it and see the ways in which it was being misrepresented by other people. And so one thing led to another, and here I am.
Well, your latest paper, alongside your co-author, Dr. Geoffrey Supran, is Rhetoric and Frame Analysis of ExxonMobil's Climate Change Communications. We will post a link to the paper in our show notes so our audience can take a look at it. It's a fantastic read. I highly encourage it. Obviously, you're also the author of Merchants of Doubt. Where else can our listeners follow your work online?
Well, I'm on Twitter, and I always announce new papers and books there. Right now, there's a 20% discount on my latest book, which is called Science on a Mission, which is a deep dive into the role of funding in science. And of course, I've got all kinds of podcasts, TED Talks, other stuff. If you Google Naomi Oreskes, one good thing about an obscure name, as far as I know, I'm the only Naomi Oreskes on the planet. So if you even just Google Naomi Harvard, I think there's one other Naomi at Harvard. So I'm pretty easy to find. Or you can also go to Amazon and see my books there. We do have a second edition of Merchants of Doubt that came out last year, kind of got lost in the shuffle of COVID-19, but it has a nice new preface by Al Gore and a new postscript by Eric and myself. In that postscript, in this new edition, we talk a little bit about renewable energy denial. So there's a bit about that. And so I'm trying to think, I have well, my own copy of my book is the original edition, but the new edition looks similar. It's just got like a little thing that says new improved. Oh, there you go. You got it there. So I hope people, if anyone hasn't read Merchants of Doubt, I hope they will get the new edition and read it. And I do think the afterword that Eric and I wrote has some good information about how the fossil fuel industry is fighting the solutions.
Well, it's as relevant now and as important now as it was when it was first released, 11 years ago. So I had
I know I want to be I want to be irrelevant. I want to retire and go fishing or whatever. I know. Whenever somebody says my work is as important now as ever, I think, well, that's depressing.
Well, it's still a fantastic read. So I
Thank
encourage
you.
everyone who hasn't read it to please go out and do so. Dr. Naomi Oreskes, thank you so much for joining the Climate Pod.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.